Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm Diarmaid, for anyone that hasn't met me, and I recently moved over to Scottish Futures Trust from Architecture and Design Scotland. So what I'm going to do is kind of lay out a bunch of thoughts, fragments of conversations, and an invitation. I think one of the first things about the COVID bit, I suppose there's two dimensions. One is the real time experience that we're all moving through the lockdown and the measures around public health. But the other side of it is that it has hit a system that already had structural weaknesses. And the evidence in Scotland and across the piece is that the more deprived areas have experienced the impacts worse. That local authorities that were organised, like North Ayrshire, around some of the local bits, were better able to respond. Other authorities were in a different situation. So there's two bits. One is the emergency response and what we're experiencing. And the second bit is that the experience hits places that were already struggling. So I suppose what's really important around that is that Scottish Government are thinking about what now and where next. So there's a kind of a bunch of priorities emerging. So about the response, the current response, but then around the recovery phase. And Fiona Hislop has kind of set out the bones of an economic response. But Nicola Sturgeon is saying that it's not just a case of kind of returning to where we were, because where we were was generating all the weaknesses that we have. It's about returning things to get the economy and places moving, but also then starting to think about how we would do things differently. So the next slides are looking at some of what's coming through already from the likes of Collier's, from the likes of McKinsey's, is that the crisis itself and the transition stage around that. So for the next 6 months to 12 months to 18 months, there will be transitionary effects. So how people are able to kind of get back into work, get back into school, get back into care, will generate a series of issues. But also around those issues are potential challenges around space standards, potential challenges around the way we use space, potential challenges around some of the land use implications. Almost certainly, there's been very significant challenge to shared spaces internally and externally. There's been challenges around hygiene management. The home working is not home working. We're in an emergency response, so if we're to do it more systemically, but the evidence is suggesting that at least 5% in the transition stage would permanently move to home base and then would look kind of for more local settings. So the implication of that is that there's a suggestion that this is going to have some quite significant effects on the way space and place is managed. In Fiona Hislop's piece, I suppose there's a kind of a 4-step process, but part of that is about how do we deal with the now, and then how do we stay focused on where Scotland wants to position. So before the COVID thing kicked off, in Scottish Government, 3 big bubbles were starting to kind of coalesce around how their infrastructure investment plan were going to work, how the programme for government's going to work, and how a suite of different things are coming together. And those 3 pieces are around inclusive growth, and it's a contested term, but I suppose now what it's saying is that there needs to be an even distribution of benefits across the country, geographically within neighbourhoods, within cities. Second, on the low carbon agenda, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can't do one and forget about the other. You have to do the 2 together. And then the third part is around the spatial bit of that, how that kind of comes together in places. So the three bits of that were coming together, but the thing that's cutting across it is resilience, not as another bubble, but as a quality that should emerge in the way that all these things kind of come together. And that brings you into kind of 3 phases, if you like. So if that is the long-term trajectory and the resilience is the thing that we're learning about at the moment, the 3 phases are the short-term stuff. So the short-term stuff almost certainly will extend social distancing, will extend shielding for the most vulnerable. The issues for the care homes are not going to go away anyway quickly. So there will still be a bunch of issues that will have implications for how public space has been used, how streets are being used, how workspaces are being used. So there's a kind of a, if you like, a tactical urbanism short-term issue. Second bit around the transition, and I'll show some of what's happened around the distribution of public services in this, but that then starts to create very big questions around what you do next, with an almost certain recession coming on the back of massive public sector borrowing for the crisis and the Brexit scenario, and then restructuring globally. Final bit then is kind of what do the future places look like? And I think Academy of Urbanism is well placed because the future of places, in a way, just pushes on some of the narratives that we have been working on together around more inclusive neighborhoods, more low carbon settings, a place based approach. But now more than ever, we need to make sure that people have examples of what that looks like. Going back to Fiona Hyslop's bit, the Scottish Government, the local authorities, and other people are starting to question what should we invest in, what should we do, and why. So to have examples of what can achieve these objectives, whether it's through a cultural lens, whether it's through a neighborhood lens, will be quite important. So people feel, yes, there are things we can do, there are people that can do it, and there are things that can be done. If you break that down into the places that we had, one of the key criticisms that's been emerging is that there was an increasing centralizing tendency, particularly around public services. So you had concentrations of things in certain places. And linked to that are the arguments that are kind of coming out now around density. So that's in a pre-COVID world. What's happened in terms of the response, you'll have all have seen the school hubs, but there's also a series of community hubs. So in a weekend, North Ayrshire established 6 neighbourhood hubs across the whole of the territory. Dundee established 8 across the whole of the territory. And then there's a series of community hubs. And those hubs are delivering learning, delivering support to small businesses, they're delivering community support and an integrated thing. So what essentially has happened in a crisis is we've decentralized our public services model. And that's a temporary kind of arrangement. But that has also led to new and different partnerships. Local food suppliers, local service suppliers are kind of working. So we've got a decentralized model. What's interesting around the Glasgow response, around the emptiness of the public spaces and the streets, is that's then driving a kind of a tactical urbanism approach around relieving public spaces and making it easier for people to walk around, making it easier for all the things to kind of go. But we also then have to start looking about what the extended period of that looks like. One of the phases has been sense making. And again, I think this is one of the areas that the Academy is ideally placed to do, making sense of what's happening, making sense of the possibilities, making sense of the futures. And around that making sense bit, 5 themes emerged from the conversations that were coming out thus far. So the headings are the experiences of COVID now are manifesting vulnerabilities and the well-being stress of that cascading across the household. So we've got a vulnerabilities issue. Vulnerabilities are one of the key bits. Second bit is around localism. The responses have tended to work really well at local and community levels. Third bit is that a bunch of capabilities have now become manifest. People know their area, people know the community, people know the issues. Fourth bit, the SECC has been adapted into a hospital. We're starting to see massive infrastructure adapted to other purposes. So adaptability has become one of the core bits of how we do it. Brewdog has shifted production from alcohol into hand sanitizer. Schools are making PPE. Colleges are starting to prototype new forms of protection gear. So the final one is around common purpose. In a number of the areas, food resilience and management have aligned partners in a way that's never happened before. So the resilience bit then is almost saying, well, if they're the issues that are coming up from the experience of folk, we should address vulnerabilities in the future. We should support local. We should value capabilities. We should build adaptability, and we should sustain momentum. And then that kind of brings you back to the Venn diagram to say, okay, if they're the things you want to do in the resilience bit, what does that look like as an inclusive net zero carbon place? And so the diagram here is just kind of chucking some things out. The decentralized services will continue in some form or other. The tactical urbanism could drive into a more systemic green travel approach. We could see innovation around prevention and care. We could see innovation around carbon. We could see innovation around local manufacturing. In absolute terms, creative and culture are going to be one of the galvanizing things to kind of bring people back together. So programming of places becomes a new and different thing. So if you take those phases, the world we had, it was the world we had, some good, some bad. The response, people have done stuff in an emergency, fine. Now we have to look at what happens in the next 6 months and what is the role of space and place in that. and then look at that as a platform to cascade into the future. So the final slide then kind of goes back to the beginning. I guess one way of reading Fiona Hislop's tweet is to say that the government are thinking about the economic plan, but absolutely that economic plan is going to have to be co-produced with the communities of Scotland, with the institutions of Scotland, with the people of Scotland. So to respond, it's happened, reset. You cannot just do a command and control approach on that. You've got to do it with the country, restart. Okay, so get some things moving, but the recovery then is about the new and different thing. So I've set down some time horizons there. There's the now bit. So the tweet has gone out yesterday, but that's on the back of early doors thinking. In the next 6 weeks, the government and others are starting to think about how does this kind of come together. And I guess that then kicks off a 1 year time horizon, you know, for the government to do stuff, but also a 1 year time horizon between now and the Congress in Edinburgh next year. And that invites some things. What could the Academy do? So I've just suggested some things. One is data. It's about the experience of us as a community living through this, so that the data of what we're doing is as important as the actions. There is something around the celebration bit, perhaps in the Congress, some of the innovation that's happening across Britain and the wider economy of how communities have adapted to this thing could be picked up, and we can highlight, you know, a situated evidence. So at local level, using tactical urbanism, using place thinking, using community networks, people have done these things. The insights, the Academy is well placed because of the European network. So in different countries, different people will be doing different things simultaneously. And we've got relationships and pace and communication channels to be able to do it. Brian really mentioned some very important stuff around, in a small country, we've got research institutions that will be working together and potentially can coalesce around some subject matter, so we can see different time horizons, the government doing stuff and activists doing stuff and research doing stuff, you know, a kind of a spreading of that. And the final bit is that a number of communities are going to come out really vulnerable from this situation. So empowering communities by either looking at place partnerships or by wrapping around them in some way and offering support or resources or whatnot, you know, so to kind of leverage the things we have might be helpful. So to kind of bring it back to the 4-point plan, the 4-point plan is not a plan, it's just a set of propositions. The plan is based on a response to the crisis. The response to the crisis, in absolute terms, has been determined by the way that people at local level in places have done things. So the Academy, as a network, as a community, as a wider body of practice, has potentially not the leading role in the recovery, but I would have thought a really great opportunity to be able to input and shape the narrative of the next step. Thank you.